Welcome to Fringe Pop 321, the show that believes the world is stranger than we think, but thinking should not be strange. This is part 2 of our overview of the lost city and continent of Atlantis. Again, the subject is so vast, we just couldn't do it in one episode. If you haven't seen part 1, you should watch that first, but we'll do a little review here anyway. The lost city of Atlantis is one of the most enduring mysteries in human history, and it all starts with Plato. As far as ancient texts that actually specifically mention Atlantis, we're really dependent on the work of the philosopher Plato, who lived in 428 to 348 BC. Now in part 1 we did cover some other texts, or at least mention them, that describe a circular city, but don't use the term. So the material is pretty old. Now using a character in one of his dialogues, what Plato did was describe a war between Athens and Atlantis. Atlantis was an island situated near the straits called the Pillars of Hercules, really the Rock of Gibraltar, the south of Spain, and the other one was a mountain on North Africa. Those were the two pillars. The city itself was splendid, surrounded by circular harbors, again had that bullseye effect, which again is mentioned in other texts, but they don't actually say Atlantis. Plato's the only one that actually uses that term. Plato's Atlantis was an empire, but it lost to Athens in its war of aggression, and afterwards Atlantis was destroyed in a violent earthquake and floods. The sunken island became an impassable barrier to sailors. And all of that, again, supposedly, happened 9,000 years before Plato's own time. Now we also noted in part 1 that if you care about what Plato actually says, if you assign his words any accuracy or historicity, then your candidates for Atlantis need to be at least in the Aegean or near the Strait of Gibraltar, and maybe creeping into the Mediterranean and other places, somewhere in the neighborhood. You've really got sort of two general candidate areas. There's the Aegean and the Mediterranean, again, not near the Straits of Gibraltar, but you're at least still sort of in the neighborhood. The major candidates there, of course, would be Santorini because of the eruption of Thera. You also have islands near Cyprus and Malta, Helike and Tantalus, which is in Asia Minor. Those are the major candidates in that part of the world. Then the favorite again is Santorini because of the eruption of Thera and the damage, the destruction that caused. If you do move out toward the Straits of Gibraltar, then you're talking about, well, maybe Andalusia, a place called Tartessos might be the location of the mythical Atlantis, or Spartel Bank, which is a landmass that is now submerged in the area. You could stretch things out beyond the Straits of Gibraltar into the Atlantic, and there you're going to hit the Azores and Madeira near Portugal. These are all candidates for Atlantis being a historical place at one time. Now, all of those proposals do have problems. Hence, Atlantis theories live on, and there's really been no resolution. We'll hit some of these more specifically in future episodes of Fringe Pop 321. But for now, we want to take time to overview the weird theories, the things that are not attached really in any way to what Plato said. We can start our survey of weird Atlantis candidates in the early modern European period. Now, in the wake of the Renaissance, which was roughly 1300s, 1400s, there was a revival of interest in Greek and Latin literature. It had been rediscovered. And so naturally, when people start reading that material, they come across Plato's comments about Atlantis. Now, subsequent to that, and sort of leading into it, you have the Age of Discovery. Think of Columbus, Magellan, explorers that were trying to circumnavigate the globe, maybe find again other continents, the other side of the world. That's the era right after the Renaissance. And so there was this knowledge of Atlantis, or at least an inkling of it, combined with this sort of exploration. Now, eventually they discovered new worlds, they discovered new cities, new people groups, and that naturally raised the question, hey, where'd those people come from? Who built those cities? How did they get there? Now, Ronald Fritz, in his important book Invented Knowledge, explained it this way. According to the medieval worldview, which was a mixture of Judeo-Christian and Greco-Roman concepts, there were three continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. These three continents were inhabited by the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. All humans could trace their ancestry back to Adam, the first man. The discovery of the Americas upset all of these cosmographic assumptions. South and North America were two continents not envisioned in the medieval worldview, and were inhabited by humans who possessed no apparent connection to any of the sons of Noah or to Adam. During the 16th and 17th centuries, many theories were put forward to explain the origins of the Native Americans and the place of the Americas. In the history of geography, some writers turned to the concept of Atlantis and the Atlanteans for an explanation. So what Fritz is saying in summary is that they had a problem. There were a lot of people, these explorers were no exception, that had sort of been raised in terms of their worldview on the Bible. And the Bible could not account for these other continents. And so what are we going to do? Now, the option of some was to sort of find all these things in the Bible somewhere, but others thought, hey, what about Atlantis? I mean, Plato talked about this missing continent. Maybe that's where these people came from. Now, leading intellects of the day like Athanasius Kircher theorized Atlantis must have been a now lost continent between Europe and the New World, somewhere out in the middle of the Atlantic. That's really beyond the Straits of Gibraltar, really on steroids. He is way out in the Atlantic, but that was the prevailing idea. Again, because of this combination of what Plato said and what they were actually finding on their voyages. Now, as people and explorers were postulating in the early European period that, hey, maybe Atlantis is the explanation for the new worlds and the new people we're discovering, they started to argue. There were two variations of an Atlantean explanation for the newly discovered Americas. The first is called the Atlantean refugee hypothesis, and that's kind of self-explanatory. You would have refugees from the lost, submerged continent of Atlantis that got off on boats or something, and they went to other land masses and they had kids, and that's the explanation. The second is the idea that the Americas were themselves surviving vestiges, physical vestiges, of the continent of Atlantis itself. They're pieces of Atlantis. Now, the latter view was the point of departure for Sir Francis Bacon's concept of Atlantis in the Americas. Bacon lived from 1561 to 1626, and this sort of naturally took hold in the minds of a lot of people. Bacon's theory was popularized in his unfinished but later published book, New Atlantis. Though its details were entirely fabricated, the American Atlantis theory endured for more than 200 years. The thesis dominated the study of Atlantis well into the 19th century. Without a doubt, the most popular book on Atlantis ever written is Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis, the Antediluvian World in 1882. Antediluvian, by the way, is a term that means before the flood. The reference is the biblical flood. Now, what Donnelly did was, based on the science of his day in geology, linguistics, and paleontology, he tried in some ways to harmonize the Bible with the story of Atlantis. It's kind of a two-edged sword because, on the one hand, the science he's using sounded good. It sounded authoritative. There was scientific talk in his book. The science of the day, again, was used, so it impressed people. But this was all 19th century science, and all of its fundamental ideas have since been overturned and abandoned in all these disciplines. For instance, do you trust 19th century medicine? Like, would you really trust that? Well, geology, geography, linguistic research that Donnelly used to sort of marry the biblical worldview with what Plato said about Atlantis, and of course coming up with all sorts of crazy theories to get Atlantis out into the Atlantic and ultimately to the Americas, was based on things that might have sounded impressive for its day, but today just don't hold water anymore at all. The next stage in weird Atlantis theories would be the 19th century. Now, we have writers like Donnelly writing in this period, and they became grist for the mill of other writers, namely occultist writers like the prolific theosophist Elena Petrovna Blavatsky, who lived from 1831 to 1891. Blavatsky's two-volume work, Isis Unveiled, published in 1881, mentions Atlantis only 4 times, basically just to comment on the material in Plato. Her later two-volume tome, The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, is an entirely different story. She basically used one myth to build her own myths. Atlantis actually became central to Blavatsky's strange speculations about the evolution of the cosmos and humanity. The Atlanteans became Blavatsky's 4th root race, arising 850,000 years ago. But the Atlanteans again factor into this particular root race and become important for some of her thinking about the evolution of humans as we know ourselves. You might ask, well, where did Blavatsky get her ideas? Well, I mean, what prompted her to sort of marry the myth of Atlantis in Plato with some of the other stuff that we talk about here and that she talked about in her books? She would get her information during trances. She allegedly got visions from ascended masters, or her ascended masters that appeared to her translated the secret book of Xian, composed in a language called Senzar. Of course, the reality of this book and even this language has never been actually established, but that really didn't stop Blavatsky from these claims. Blavatsky's ideas quickly filtered down to other occult movements, fixated on lost history and theories about racial evolution and purity. All sorts of occult groups imbibe Blavatsky's root races approach and Atlantean lost knowledge in their own pursuit of alternative history. Again, something between materialist science and Darwinism, and on the other side, Judeo-Christianity. Blavatsky provided a middle ground for alternative history. You'd see this kind of thing on the History Channel, otherwise known as the Fantasy Channel, to be quite honest with you. They often provide programming about Atlantis and ancient aliens, and they deeply draw on Blavatsky. And so if you want her view, the Theosophist view on Atlantis, that's a good resource. Now, unfortunately, a lot of this gets baptized by Christian groups as well, in their own theories about how to explain architecture, like mound building over here in North America. They will use the Atlantean theories of Blavatsky to argue that, well, it wasn't really the Atlanteans that came over here and built these things, and it couldn't have been the Native Americans, they were just too stupid. Instead, it was the Nephilim. So Blavatsky's influence, the influence of Atlantis, in prompting all sorts of strange ideas as to how to explain North and South America and their populations, this is sort of the pool from which all of that kind of stuff is drawn. It's really a lot of nonsense at the end of the day, because its source, in Blavatsky's case, were visions and ascended masters, people talking in her head. But for our purposes now, this is an important Weird Atlantis candidate that you will run into quite a bit on the internet and of course on TV. Our last alternative Atlantis in the weird category is the Atlantis of Edgar Cayce, America's sleeping prophet. Cayce, of course, is well known for going into trance sleeps and awaking with knowledge about all sorts of things. He mentioned Atlantis in his prophecies more than 700 times. And 700 times, I mean, what can he say? We know from Plato really only had a few paragraphs. 700 times. Well, Cayce was getting information in his sleep about all sorts of topics with very, very, very specific details. According to Cayce, Atlanteans used crystals and sound waves for healing. They had elevators and connecting tunnels in their city that were operated with compressed air and steam, believe it or not. They used quartz crystal science to mine gold and copper and silver from the earth. They developed silicon memory chips and lasers. They had giant laser power plants, didn't you know? They made extensive use of mass mental telepathy and psychokinesis and astral projection. I wish I were making this up, but I'm not. This is where Cayce was at. Casey's trance information raises a good question. How did Plato miss all that stuff? Well, I guess we'll never know. Well, that was sure an interesting ride. It's a far cry from Plato for sure, but that's where Atlantean research, which is actually better called speculation, is at today. We'll be drilling down into some specific Atlantis theories in later episodes because, believe it or not, it does get weirder with more detail. Thanks for watching this episode of Fringe Pop. Please visit our website for information about this episode and this topic, and of course other episodes and topics. And come back and watch some more, because what you know may not be so.